Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Transitions. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a research fellow at the East West Center, and I'm very excited to be here today moderating today's event. For today's event, we have a presentation from Dr. Sandeep Kandikuppa. Sandeep is a brand new research fellow in the research program. He has a PhD in ecology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In his doctoral research, he examined the causes and dimensions of the question of rural indebtedness in India. Prior to his doctoral studies, Sandeep worked as a practitioner for nearly 10 years with some of the leading nonprofits in India. His current research interests include new farmers' movements in India, government financial inclusion programs, and human-environment interaction in the context of land and water commons in rural India. In his presentation today, it focuses on two aspects of rural indebtedness in India. First, he will lay out the precise dimensions of indebtedness, and in doing so, demonstrate how it is differentiated across different classes, castes, and gender. Second, he will show what it is like for rural households to live with their debts. And in terms of logistics, Sandeep's presentation will be roughly 40 minutes long. Then after the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. And if you would like to ask Sandeep a question, feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box, and we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. Our next EWC Insight speaker will be Dr. Ryan Longman, and his talk is entitled The Pacific Drought Knowledge Exchange, Stakeholder Engagement in Guam, and it will be held on June 15th at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Without further ado, I will end the introduction here, and Sandeep, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Panwin, for that wonderful introduction. It gives me great pleasure to be presenting my work in front of this August gathering. In today's talk, I will be titled Debts, Desires, and Distress, How the Rural Poor of Andhra Pradesh Navigate Indebtedness. I present two views of the problem of indebtedness. One, I look at it from the top using large secondary data sets. I try and present an overview, a statistical overview of the problem. And secondly, I look at it from below. I look at it through the eyes of the farmers and try to talk about how rural communities in Andhra Pradesh live with their debts. This presentation is based on my doctoral dissertation. In the first part of my presentation, I will be providing a brief introduction to rural indebtedness, the meaning, the definitions, the measures, and some current trends in rural indebtedness. Then I'll follow it up by examining how rural indebtedness is differentiated by socioeconomic indicators. How does it vary across rural classes, caste, gender? And third, I'll be focusing on the lived experiences of indebtedness. What is it like for rural households to live with their debts? What are the strategies that they adopt, and what approaches do they take in order to exist with their debts? And I'll end my presentation by looking at the policy implications of my research and with a brief discussion of the current research projects that I'm pursuing. So I want to start my introduction to rural indebtedness with this quote from the famous novel Godan by Munshi Premchand. It goes, "My grain was all weighed out at the village barn. The master took his share and the moneylender his, leaving me with just 10 pounds. This quote in many ways encapsulates the fraught relationship that rural households in India have with their debt. It embodies the anxieties and the precarity that debt tends to engender among the rural poor. In India, the image of a cowering, reed-thin farmer cowering in front of an overfed moneylender is one of those timeless representations of Indian agriculture. Over the years, this image has been immortalized by movies and countless works of fiction. However, what scholars like David Hardiman have shown is that this practice of money lending goes as, at least as far back as the Middle Ages. Even back then, buccaneering money lenders would travel to far corners of the Indian countryside, extend credit to resource poor farmers, and find ways to actually recover their money successfully. However, in the last 150 years, almost every single farmers' agitation in India has been animated by debt, has been undergirded by debt. So whether it is the Deccan riots of 1875, the Telangana agitation that we had in 1940s and 50s, and the Karza Mukti, or freedom from debt movement that we had in India in the 80s and 90s, each of these movements, farmers were agitated by increasing debt burdens. More recently, in the year 2018, India was rocked by a series of farmers' protests. Farmers from across the length and breadth of the country, ranging from Tamil Nadu in the south to Rajasthan and Punjab in the north, took to the streets, and uncannily, the demand and the rallying cry of all these protests was relief from debt. And for me as a scholar, it was really uncanny that farmers who are separated by decades and generations were rallying around this issue of rural indebtedness. So for me as a scholar, it was important to understand what is it about debt in 2018 that was agitating farmers so much. So without further ado, what is indebtedness? What are its meanings and how is it measured? So simply put, indebtedness is the state of owing money. However, if you look at scholars like Marcel Mauss or David Graeber, they would say that indebtedness is not just about money. It can also be about an obligation that remains unfulfilled, favor that remains unrendered, or it can be some kind of a gift that is yet to be returned. However, for the purposes of this paper, I look at cash debts, and within this context, indebtedness can mean a state where debt becomes a significant financial burden for a household or for an entity, or a state where borrowers are struggling to meet their payment deadlines. In conventional literature, debt has been measured using a few standard indicators. First is the number of loans borrowed. So whether a household has 2 loans outstanding or 5 loans outstanding, the amount outstanding, whether a household owes 10,000 rupees or $20,000 or $500,000, and then you have debt ratios. These are essentially looking at debts in relation to certain other financial parameters of a household or an entity. So for instance, the debt to asset ratio looks at debt in relation to the total assets that a household possesses, or the debt to income ratio looks at the debt in relation to the gross income of the household. Each of these ratios is trying to ascertain whether the household has the wherewithal to fulfill its debt obligations or not. Looking at some recent current trends of rural indebtedness, what I find is that over in the 2 decades that my study encompasses, there has been a significant increase in all the major parameters of indebtedness, whether it is the number of loans taken, whether it is the amount outstanding, or the debt to asset ratio. There has been a significant increase in the period between 92 to 2013. The reason why my data stops at 2013 is, as on date, the subsequent waves of data have not been released by the National Sample Survey Office. Spatially speaking, across all regions of India, there has been an increase in household indebtedness in rural areas. However, as we see in this map, some regions have experienced a sharper increase than others. For instance, the state of Andhra Pradesh in the south parts of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, the state of Rajasthan in the north, these regions have experienced a sharper increase in household debt burdens relative to other states. And while it would not be entirely accurate to draw a direct correlation, it's worth mentioning that some of these regions have also experienced significant changes in the way they do agriculture. For instance, in all the states that I just mentioned, there has been an explosion in commercial agriculture. There has been an explosion in intensive farming practices, the abstraction of groundwater, application of the heavy application of chemical inputs. And as scholars have shown, all of these factors are known to be contributing to increasing household debt burdens in some way or the other. Over the years, there have been 4 dominant narratives that have emerged as far as rural indebtedness is concerned. And each of these narratives provides a compelling shorthand for the problem, but at the same time, each of these narratives leaves a number of questions unanswered. So the first of these narratives is that farmers are under crushing debt. True, but which farmers are under crushing debt? And what is the magnitude of their indebtedness? Second, the indebted are victims who are caught in a vicious cycle. Yes, but what is it? What are the factors that place them in that vicious cycle in the first place? Third, that indebtedness is at the root of agrarian distress. Yes, over the years, indebtedness has become synonymous with agrarian distress, in fact. However, what is it about debt that induces distress among rural households? Why is it that rural households find themselves under such enormous stress when it comes to dealing with their debts? And finally, that loan waivers and improving supply of formal credit can solve the problem of indebtedness. However, as we are seeing even today, despite successive waves of loan waivers provided by the government, and despite a significant increase in the availability of formal credit, the problem of indebtedness continues unabated. So I use these narratives and the questions that each of these narratives engenders as the point of departure to examine in my own investigations of rural indebtedness. So, and the first, to begin with, I ask how rural indebtedness is differentiated across different classes and different socioeconomic indicators of rural households. So I asked, how does the magnitude of indebtedness vary across rural classes, caste, and gender? And for the purpose of this segment, I use the data from All India Debt and Investment Survey. AIDIS is administered by the National Sample Survey of the Government of India and is the preeminent data set which is designed exclusively to study the problem of rural indebtedness. So I use 3 waves of this data, namely 93, 2002, 92, 2003, and 2013. In defining rural classes, I lean on the works of Barbara Harris White and later works by Vamsi Vakulabharnam and Mariam Aslani. And I develop a 4-class structure. The rural elite, first is rural elite. These are large and medium farmers, people with substantial land holdings, who might also be involved in salaried employment. And rural elite also encompasses people who are involved in business or trade of some kind. And then you have the rural middle class. These are medium-sized farmers and all other salaried employees. Then you have the petty commodity producers. These are the marginal farmers, marginal and small farmers, farmers with less than 5 acres of land holdings. Mind you, it is these farmers who comprise the bulk of the farmers who are protesting, who are participating in the protests that we are seeing in recent years. And then you have wage workers, households which are almost entirely dependent on agricultural and non-agricultural wage labor for livelihood. I look at 6 different dimensions of indebtedness. 4 of them measure indebtedness. The other 2 are associated indicators which help us understand the problem of indebtedness better. So there is the number of loans borrowed, the total amount borrowed, the total amount outstanding, the debt to asset ratio, and the likelihood of being over indebted. And then for among the other dimensions, I look at the number of loans taken from informal sources, and the interest that is paid by rural households. Just to give a quick descriptive snapshot, there is really, when we look at the mean number of loans, there is really nothing much to differentiate one rural class from the other. However, when we look at the debt to asset ratio, a very interesting story pops out at us. So the debt to, for instance, the wage workers have seen a quantum leap in their overall debt burden. Interestingly, petty commodity producers, like I said, it is people from this class who constitute the bulk of protesters who are demanding relief from debt. Interestingly, their debt burden relative to the other classes is significantly lower. The key findings from this segment are: one, that rural elite tend to borrow significantly higher amounts. This is not entirely surprising. This class of people is likely to borrow for big ticket investments or big ticket purchases, maybe a house, a car, a piece of land, or so on and so forth. Second, wage workers are deeper in debt. Given the uncertain income flows, given the fact that wage workers have to seek work almost on a day-to-day basis, it is not entirely surprising that they rely on borrowings to achieve consumption smoothing from time to time. However, what is really surprising is that petty commodity producers, these have a significantly lower debt burden compared to other classes. So, whatever be the reason why debt is causing them distress, it is certainly not the magnitude of debt which is the problem. The problem perhaps lies elsewhere, and we need to explore that further. Among other findings, the poorer households, whether it is petty commodity producers or the wage workers, tend to pay a significantly higher interest on the loans that they take relative to other classes. Asset poor households tend to be more reliant or tend to lean on informal moneylenders a lot more than other classes. And indigenous households, households belonging to indigenous communities and marginalized castes, they interestingly rely on formal sources, banks. So they tend to access bank loans much more relative to other caste groups. And finally, women have shown greater reliance on social networks. So they tend to borrow more from their friends, relatives, or from their neighbors than from any kind of institutionalized lending sources, whether it be formal or informal. Now, like I said, this is a bird's eye view of the problem of indebtedness. All these numbers are important, but they don't really tell us what it is like, what is the experiential dimension of indebtedness. So the key takeaways from this paper from this segment are: one, that indebtedness is a nuanced problem. Not all households are indebted alike, and household characteristics, whether it be caste of the household, class of the household, whether it is the assets that they have access to, all play a critical role in determining how indebted, the size of indebtedness and perhaps even the nature of indebtedness. Second, there is a clear need to look beyond numbers. If these numbers were the only guiding, if we were to be solely guided by the numbers, then we would have to conclude that petty commodity producers, the small and marginal farmers, are really not indebted and that they have really no cause to be protesting. And yet we find that they have been protesting for a significant amount of time now. And it's important to look beyond numbers to understand what is really causing them distress. And finally, the persistence of informal moneylenders. Despite decades of efforts by subsequent governments to dislodge informal moneylenders, what we find is that they have not gone anywhere. And indeed, in recent decades, they have enjoyed a sort of resurgence. And why is this so? Why is it that rural households still turn to informal moneylenders is something that we need to understand. Now, in the subsequent section, we look at I delve into the lived experiences of indebtedness. Like I mentioned, the previous section presented a view from the top. This is a view from below. I focus on the lived experiences of indebtedness as narrated by rural households in Andhra Pradesh, the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. So the aim in this segment is to contend with the everydayness of indebtedness. And I focus on one particular practice, namely the practice of loan renewals. And I ask, why is it that rural households of Andhra Pradesh resort to this practice? So for the purpose of this, for this segment, I use semi-structured qualitative interviews that I did in 3 sub-districts, in 2 districts of Andhra Pradesh. So this is located in the southern part of India, and this region experiences arid, semi-arid agroclimatic conditions. So it's characterized by erratic rainfall, poor soils. There is a heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture. But there are 3 big reasons why I chose this particular region. One, this region is amidst sweeping agrarian transitions. Even 25 years ago, this region, landlords were a big presence in this region. They were among the most powerful and most important players in the rural landscape. And since they controlled most of the means of production, they were able to engineer these extremely exploitative tenancy arrangements with sharecroppers, and the result was, it was a highly exploitative system. However, in recent decades, this landlord-centric system has weakened significantly, and in its place, so this is one major agrarian transition. Secondly, this region has experienced an explosion in commercial agriculture, in the cultivation of in intensive agricultural practices. And this region, agriculture in this region is virtually almost entirely underwritten by groundwater. So 85 to 90% of agriculture in this region is made possible only through groundwater. And so these are the major agrarian transitions that have occurred in this region. Second, there has been an explosion of lending sources, whether it be banks or private money lenders or various finance companies that have set up shop in this region. You have self-help groups. Andhra Pradesh pioneered self-help groups in many ways in India. And within Andhra Pradesh, this region has also experienced a significant increase in self-help groups. And you also have a number of caste groups which were hitherto not engaged in the business of money lending, getting into the business of money lending. So, for instance, you have a number of Dalit communities and marginalized communities who have gotten salaried employment, plowing back some of their earnings into money lending business. And they tend to extend credit to people back in their villages. So there has been an explosion of lending sources as far as an average rural borrower is concerned. And thirdly, I happen to work in this region for a number of years. So I want to start off this section with a small parable. This is the parable of Lord Balaji. This is the temple of Tirupati. And this temple is located about 2 hours away from my study site. Now, the legend has it that this god borrowed money from the celestial moneylender to fund his wedding. And as it happens, he is still repaying the loan. So the billions of rupees that the temple collects from its devotees who drop their offerings in the receptacle that all of you see on your right, the billions of rupees are apparently barely enough to service the interest on the loan that he has taken. Now, contrast this devotee-assisted experience of the Lord with the experience of Ramappa and Lakshmi. Now, these are small farmers, 5 to 6 acres of land, and they have a total outstanding loans in excess of 500,000 rupees, that is close to $7,000. Now, for farmers of this size, it is a significant amount of money. Now, they have taken 5 big loans from 4 different sources, ranging from the bank to their friends, to fellow farmers, to local self-help groups. And in addition, and this is not counting the number of small loans that they keep taking on an almost daily basis from their friends and neighbors. These are called Chai Badalu. So they take them for a 15 days or 20 days and repay them within that time frame. Now, when I was, and for them who don't have millions of devotees to help them with repayment, keeping up with keeping up their loans, staying on top of their loans is a constant race. And so when I was in conversation with them, I asked them how they actually did it. How is it that they were able to keep track of all their loans and stay on top of them? So their response was, I will pay my interest today and renew my loans. So loan renewal, this is loan renewal. Essentially, what we are doing is pay the interest today and reschedule the final repayment of the loan to a later date. Now, this is a practice that is widely permitted by both the banks and informal money lenders for entirely different reasons, as we shall see. Now, some would argue, and rightly so, that this practice results in debts piled on debts. I mean, when you see, within no time, the rural borrowers of Andhra Pradesh find that they are confronted with a mountain of debt and that they are paying thousands of rupees every year as interest to service these numerous loans. But in some ways, this practice also embodies an exercise of agency by the rural poor. So in an environment where so little is under their control, where rural poor, the rural households, agricultural households of this region, do not have any control over the price of the commodities, the cost of cultivation, cost of the inputs, availability of labor, the weather. In such a fraught environment, loan renewals offer them a modicum of opportunity to exercise some agency, to exercise some control. Now, loan renewals get operationalized in two different ways. How does loan renewals get operationalized? So with banks, banks basically allow renewals by deducting old loan from the new loan amount. So for instance, if I borrowed 10,000 rupees this year, and at the end of the year, I pay the interest of 300 rupees, and I pay the bank and then ask for another loan of say 20,000 rupees. The bank will deduct 10,000 from the new loan and it will issue me only 20,000 rupees. This is how banks will do the loan renewal. Money lenders, on the other hand, allow loans to be piled on top of one another. So if I borrow 10,000 in this year, I have to pay the interest at the end of the year and I renew the loan. If I take another loan of say 20,000 rupees, my total outstanding debt at the end of 2 years would be 30,000 rupees. So the interest that I am paying is increasing exponentially with each passing year. Now, essentially, loan renewals is about juggling multiple lenders. So the borrower is trying to keep up with the interest payment and not worry about the full and final payment of the loan. And he or she is trying to juggle multiple borrowers. And so, but what happens when a lender gets antsy? What happens when a lender starts demanding a final payment? So the quote on the right basically says what they do. I will borrow from here and there and pay the money lender off. Within this context, most money lenders are always men. Now, the practice of loan renewal is intertwined with the notion of paru or reputation. Now, reputation is virtually the legitimizing notion. It is what justifies the practice of loan renewals in many ways in this region. And this notion of paru gets operationalized in interesting ways. The first and foremost is this strong urge among rural borrowers to avoid the tag of defaulter. Whether it doesn't matter where the loan has been taken from, whether it is a bank or a private money lender. Defaulting a loan is seen, invites considerable opprobrium. So rural households are really keen to avoid the tag at any cost if they can help it. Second is the fear that money lenders will come and create a scene outside their homes, which would also lead to a loss of face, which would also lead to a loss of reputation. Now, almost every household reported having seen such a scene occur outside other people's homes. For obvious reasons, they were not going to tell me if they had had an experience like that outside their own homes. But nonetheless, they were really worried that if they did not keep up with their, if they failed to service their loans on time, moneylenders would come and create a scene outside their home. This could involve picketing their house. This could involve taking the cattle away, all of which would again lead to a loss of face among their peers. And interest, evaluating lending source. So Parvu becomes the way in which borrowers evaluate the lenders. So borrowers are constantly evaluating if approaching a particular lender might lead to a loss of face in the future. And the probability of that determines whether the borrower will approach that lender or not. So if there is a possibility if there is a possible threat to the reputation, if the borrower feels that taking a loan from a particular money lender might lead to a loss of reputation, then the borrowers tend to give this lender a wide berth. So in many ways, the paru, or the possibility of loss of reputation, becomes a litmus test as to whether a borrower should approach a lender or not. So what we find is that the idea of it symbolizes allowing loan renewals, symbolizes whether there is trust between the borrower and the lender. So what happens when there is no namakam? What happens when the trust between the borrower and the lender breaks down? The quote on the right indicates that. As one of my interlocutors told me, a few years ago, a moneylender that I regularly borrowed from demanded that I repay his entire amount immediately and in full. He threatened to initiate action against me. Immediately, I sold off a piece of my land and cleared off my loan. But from then on, I have never borrowed from him. I go to other sources for my loans. His threatening language caused us fear. It was a question of my prestige. So when Nagarjuna was confronted with an aggressive lender who demanded immediate repayment, he obliged, but then he never looked at this he also abandoned this long-standing relationship that he had with this money lender. So loan renewals in many ways help with there are means by which borrowers and lenders establish a relationship of trust. They help borrowers avoid the tag of a defaulter. And finally, loan renewals make lenders appear reasonable by allowing borrowers to renew their loans for at least a few times. Money lenders are able to appear reasonable in the eyes of the borrowers. So I will now look at how loan renewals operate in the context of banks and money lenders. So in the case of banks, there are two things that we need to understand. One is the kind of products that are offered. Another is the concept of non-performing assets, or NPAs. So typically, the banks in this region offer crop loans and gold loans, both of which are for agricultural purposes. And both of these loans are offered for a period of 1 year. So at the end of 12 months, the borrowers are expected to repay their loan in full. Now, the second one, the concept of NPAs is very, very important. When either of these loans, say for instance, the crop loan remains unpaid for 2 successive seasons after the end of the loan period, then it gets classified as a non-performing asset. So basically, it's like a bad debt, and having too many NPAs on the books shows the bank and the branch in a bad light. So banks want to keep the NPAs low. So loan renewals actually help banks with this. So by renewing loans, banks are able to, for most part, keep the NPAs off their, keep the bad loans off their books. Secondly, renewing loans reduces the exposure to risk. So you must remember that all the crop loans in this region are unsecured loans. So there is a good chance that borrowers might not repay at all. And therefore, through the practice of loan renewals, banks are able to keep their exposure to risk, they're able to keep it low. And thirdly, banks are able to continue servicing rural clients. Most of these banks are public sector banks. They're government-owned banks. So while they have the commercial mandate of lending and borrowing and doing business reasonably profitably, they also have a social mandate of taking banking to to people who might not otherwise have access to banking. So they are able to balance these seemingly contradictory mandates that they have through the practice of loan renewal. From a borrower's point of view, as far as bank loans are concerned, loan renewals help them remain creditworthy in the eyes of the bank. They help them continue accessing bank credit even in the future. And most importantly, by renewing loans, borrowers in this region stay in contention for a loan waiver. So this region, as indeed the entire state of Andhra Pradesh, witnessed subsequent rounds of loan renewals from successive governments waived off loans. Basically, they would just waive off all loans that farmers owe to public sector banks. So they would just write off these loans. And there is a strong, and since this has been done over and over again, there is a sense among rural borrowers that if they can just hold off on the repayment long enough, another loan waiver would be just around the corner. As many of my interlocutors told me, one day or the other, the government will give us runamafi, or will just give us a loan waiver. With money lenders, the loan renewals operate in a slightly different way. The reason why borrowers renew their informal loans are somewhat different. One, that by renewing their loans, the rural borrowers are able to hedge on a bumper tomato harvest. So, or generally a very good agricultural season. So as the refrain goes, one big tomato harvest and I'll clear off all my loans. So they are able to, renewing their loans allows rural borrowers in this region to hedge on a better future as far as their harvest is concerned. Now, this is also possible because of the proximity of the lenders and borrowers in this region. Unlike the banks, which are somewhat distant, the money lenders in this region know their borrowers very well. So for instance, as one of the borrowers told me, the money lender will know if there has been a death in the family, there is a wedding that is coming up, or if the borrower has had a particularly bad agricultural season. And since there is better information about the borrower that the lender has, they are more willing to allow for loan renewals to go on. Loan renewals also help the borrowers in fulfilling current social obligations like contributing to local village festivals. So by putting off the final repayment of the loan to a later date, they're able to use the resources thus freed up, the money thus freed up, to contribute to and fulfill their social obligations. Now, again, as I mentioned, from the money lender's point of view, renewing loans allows them to appear reasonable and at the same time earn higher interest rates. Now, what happens if a particular borrower, if a money lender insists on a final repayment? Like Nagarjuna, one of my interlocutors, told me, if we can't repay the loan when asked, we will lose our reputation. Thinking about it makes us lose our sleep. Now, the key takeaways from this segment are: one, in an evolving political economy where new sources of credit are emerging and where the agrarian relations are shifting, where the practices of agriculture are constantly shifting, loan renewal is a way by which rural borrowers are able to navigate the multiple lenders. Secondly, By renewing loans, rural borrowers are able to wait for a loan waiver. They're able to stay in contention for a loan waiver. Third, the notion that banks are good and all money lenders are necessarily bad is an oversimplification of the situation. What I have found, and as many of my interlocutors told me, is they approach different lenders for different purposes, and each lender has their own importance in the eyes of the rural borrowers. And finally, loan waivers have distorted incentives for both borrowers and lenders. I mean, this has been widely documented, and this was again seconded by several of my interlocutors. From what several of my interlocutors told me, that loan waivers have raised expectations among borrowers that they need, that if they can just hold off on the final payment long enough, they may not have to pay their loans at all. Now, what are the policy implications of my research? One, that to address rural indebtedness comprehensively, it is important to look beyond numbers to understand the lived experiences of indebtedness, and also to understand the deeper structural problems that underpin this issue. Second, increasing credit supply is important, but it is insufficient. A broader set of financial solutions encompassing insurance, savings, remittances, perhaps digital banking, all of them are required in order to help with household economic development in rural areas. Third, loan waivers do not address underlying factors underlying indebtedness. And finally, it is important to situate the problem of rural indebtedness within broader transitions that we are witnessing. Transitions in terms of ecological shifts, transitions in terms of the economic shifts that are happening in this place, the shifts in the importance of agriculture in the minds of rural households. All these transitions need to, the problem of indebtedness needs to be located within these broader transitions. Finally, looking at what, so using my doctoral research as the point of departure, I'm currently looking at 4 broad areas of research. First, I'm looking at the initiatives, the financial inclusion initiatives, the efficacy of financial inclusion programs in India. We're working in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance to understand if financial inclusion programs have resulted in a change in financial behavior among households in India, rural households in India. Second is look at the role that digital and mobile technology can play in the uptake of financial services by rural households. Third, moving beyond household finance, I'm looking at why Indian farmers are studying the new farmers movements in India, and specifically trying to understand what is it that motivates ordinary farmers to participate in these movements. And lastly, to examine the role of shared land and water resources as a safety net for rural households. Like, can stronger natural resource base help rural households in weathering shocks better than if they were not? So with this, I conclude my presentation. I would like to express my appreciation to East West Center for providing me with the platform, and to all of you for taking time to attend this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandeep, for the clear, informative, and very interesting presentation. And the audience clearly agree with me, as they have a lot of questions for you. I would try to group the questions by topic. And I think the first question for you, this is an excellent clarification question or a follow-up question. And that question is, what is the primary cause for increasing the need for loans?
So there are, so if you look at the existing data, there are rural households typically tend to borrow for 2 things. One is medical expenses, and second is consumption expenses, to meeting consumption expenses. So as far as medical expenses are concerned, I would argue that the decline in public investments, state investments in public health, and the growing privatization of healthcare in India are responsible for the increasing, are what are pushing rural households to borrow more in order to meet their medical care. So the government hospitals in India are broken, and even rural households also want the best possible medical care, which is usually available with private, in the private domain. But that is unfortunately very, very expensive. And second, as far as consumption expenses are concerned, I would attribute it to rising aspirations. Rural households are also keen to possess the most updated phones. I have seen rural households, take loans to purchase very, very expensive motorcycles. So consumption loans and healthcare are the two reasons driving up, driving up borrowing in rural areas, as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. The second set of questions pertains to Indigenous and marginalized groups. So this question has two parts. The first is, would a change in risk criteria by banks allow for better outcomes for Indigenous and marginalized groups? And also, as a follow-up, will you perform a type of comparison between Indigenous and marginalized to determine if there is a stratification?
I would say that yes. I mean, I think if banks were to actually, the banks do offer like there are a number of special loan products. I mean, loan products specially designed for marginalized groups. So for both for Indigenous communities and for marginalized castes. And these loans typically tend to be of a slightly lower interest than other groups. And what my study has shown is that probably because of these reasons, marginalized groups and these marginalized groups tend to access or tend to prefer formal credit more than informal credit. They're more likely to access banks for fulfilling their credit needs than other sources. What was the other question? What was the second part of the question? If you could repeat.
Will you perform a type of comparison between the two groups, Indigenous and marginalized, to determine if there is a stratification?
I should do it. I haven't done it. Yes, definitely.
Okay, moving on, focusing also on the Indigenous group. Can you elaborate more on what exactly the Indigenous group need the loan for? Are they farmers? Do they rent, or do they own land that they farm on? This is the first part of the question.
Yes, they. So the region that I studied, Indigenous groups, where I did my field work, Indigenous groups are also farmers. However, in the first part of my presentation, I looked at pan-India data, and it is very likely that households in, say, Indigenous groups in parts of Eastern India or Northeastern India might have different needs. I mean, I know for a fact that many of them practice shifting cultivation and therefore may not own, and the process of titling is still going on. The process of allotting land titles to them is still ongoing. So therefore, but many of them are practicing agriculture. Many of them are practicing, many of them are farmers. However, why do they borrow? I would again say that, the primary reason would be healthcare and consumption expenses. Although I haven't looked at it in that detail, so it would be hard for me to give you, off the top of my head. But I would imagine that healthcare and consumption expenses are still the most important reasons why Indigenous households would borrow money. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to the second part of this set of questions. Is it true that some of the Indigenous and Dalit persons are now lending money within their own communities? And are the dynamics of this lending similar to that of non-Indigenous and I believe non-Dalit lenders?
Yeah, this is very interesting. While my own study hasn't covered this aspect, scholars like Aarti Sethi have actually looked at it. They have found that Dalits and Adivasi groups who have got salaried employment have now started lending money to upper caste households. And, this is different. I mean, it does come, this is somewhat different from the more traditional money lending system that we have had in existence, because then the dynamics of caste will come into play. And in many cases, it is definitely different. It is not the same as borrowing money from the traditional money lending castes, because you have people who are traditionally seen as belonging to oppressed castes now being in a position to lend money and therefore demand repayment from people who are seen as forward castes, dominant castes. It will have its own caste-based dynamics.
All right. Okay. Thank you. To diversify the conversation, we're going to shift the question away from Indigenous briefly and then go back to the question about cooperatives and fishing industry. So the question is, have you looked at anything related to the traditional fishing industries, indebtedness, and some of the cooperatives that exist as a way for creating capital for loans and local investments?
No, that has not so far constituted a part of my research.
Okay, second question. Do you have similar situation of the establishment of cooperatives with farming?
I think a lot of effort has been made in order to establish farming cooperatives, but I think the success that they have experienced is rather limited. But you have credit cooperative societies even today. Like for instance, in Maharashtra, you've had sugarcane cooperatives, which were kind of into lending money and purchasing sugarcane crop. But as far as I know, they have kind of gone defunct. And they have also had their own spin-offs, because then those cooperatives resulted in the promotion of monoculture. Because you had, like say, sugar cooperatives, and they were giving loans, soft loans specifically for cultivation of sugarcane. Then over a period, the land in the area under sugar cooperatives have been converted almost entirely to sugarcane cultivation. And the result is now that now that Indian agriculture is kind of open, and it's now it's been agricultural commodity trading is liberalized, and commodity prices are now linked with international commodity prices. Whenever in such a monoculture environment, if there is a collapse in prices, then it actually adds to the distress of farmers. Right. This has been the experience as far as I know.
Got it. Okay. Next question is a very interesting question. It's very short too. To what extent is the loan indebtedness passed down from generation to generation?
So even 25 years ago, in the region that I studied, bonded labor was very much a practice. So, and bonded labor that was carried over across generations was very much a practice. So, and I'm talking about 1980s, even until late 1990s, this was very much prevalent. However, but that practice no longer continues. But So I think, subsequent generations are expected to repay the loans of their fathers. That expectation is still there. But compared to 20-25 years ago, the more extreme manifestations of this are not in existence anymore. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. Let's move on. And the next question focuses on groundwater in agriculture. And you mentioned the role of groundwater in agriculture, that the majority of farmers, around 85 to 90%, are dependent upon. Can you speak to some of the ecological changes and their implications, and also how might that be influencing household economies?
Yeah, absolutely. The Anantapur and Chittoor, almost 80%, 85 to 90% of all irrigation happens through groundwater irrigation. So the result is that today you have tube wells which are almost 700 to 800 feet deep, and you may still not hit water. And it's also important to understand this region has got hard rock aquifers. So it's unlike so these aquifers are unique in that it takes a lot of time to recharge. But it is easy because now you have technology to drill tube wells as deep as 2,000 feet. Then you are actually abstracting water from deep aquifers, which will not be recharged anytime soon. So the result is that groundwater levels in this region have plummeted. You find high fluoride content. You find that tube wells go dry likely to go dry very quickly. And the result, and since you can't do agriculture without tube wells, farmers in this region are prepared to invest a significant amounts of money drilling, redrilling, deepening their tube wells. And this fall in groundwater also has health costs, because high fluoride content in the groundwater because of the falling depth causes health problems, brittle bones and stuff like that. So there is a health dimension to this problem. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it has a direct bearing on household economies, in that cost of cultivation goes up, the amount of expenditure that household incurs goes up, and as a result, borrowing is likely to go up as well.
Okay, excellent answer. Okay, we have about 2 minutes left. So if you could spend at most 1 minute answering 2 more questions, that would be most efficient. Okay. Next question. Was there an opportunity in your study to find out how farmers are using the money from their loans, and what are their priorities?
Yeah, money, you would know, money is fungible. So yes, farmers borrow money for a particular purpose, but if something urgent comes up, they will not hesitate to use the money for that purpose. So even if they have to, they will use an agricultural loan for a medical emergency or to meet some kind of a social obligation. So yes, so that is a very prevalent practice in this region.
Got it. Okay, next question pertains to microfinance. Could you please talk about what happened after microfinance crisis in Andhra Pradesh in the early 2000s?
Well, microfinance institutions were put in their place. And this is now, I think the crisis was precipitated by the aggressive recovery loan recovery practices that these institutions had. But since the crisis, microfinance institutions have largely have become more circumspect, I would say. And I think rural borrowers are also kind of, since they know that there are so many sources of lending, they are able to deal with the microfinance institutions with a little more, from a stronger footing, relatively speaking. But still, the practice of borrowing from A to pay B is widely prevalent. So, microfinance institutions offer loans at low interest rates, and rural households appreciate those loans. But when the repayment time comes, they will take loan from a different institution, probably another microfinance institution, to service this loan. So it's a, but I would say the kind of aggressive behavior that microfinance institutions displayed in that phase is kind of reduced significantly.
Okay, I know it's already 3 p.m., but we still have a lot of questions left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions. Okay, how much is this story about debt in your field sites compared to the rest of India and compared to the rest of the world? In other words, how does your study reveal site-specific findings on rural indebtedness, or does this more point to a more of global trends?
I can speak for India, and definitely what I have found in Andhra Pradesh plays out in some form or the other in different parts of the country. Now, even globally speaking, the presence of predatory lending practices, the high interest rates, the tensions that rural households experience between accessing formal sources and informal sources. I think this is a phenomenon that we have seen in many other places in Global South. Why Global South? Even in the United States, you have loan sharks. You have payday loans, right? Payday loans is nothing different from private money lenders, and even there, this whole thing about you paying 500% interest is also kind of stories that we have heard in the United States. So I would say that my understanding is that borrowing is universal. We all have to borrow, and unfortunately, informal money lenders are also universal. And therefore, the experience of distress that we have is, I think, it can be found in many other contexts as well, I would say.
Okay, I think we have to end here. It's already 3:02. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for the excellent presentation. And thank you to all our audience for joining us and participating in the session this afternoon. And I also would like to invite all of you to our next EWC Insights on June 15th for a talk by Dr. Ryan Longman. And again, thank you for joining today.